The great thing about Elden Ring or every Dark Souls game before Elden Ring is that you can do a lot with pretty much any weapon in the game. That's the coolest thing about this game. And speaking of Elden Ring, with the new Ashes of War system, you can do so much with your weapons, and nearly every weapon can be powerful if you take the time to customize it. But that doesn't mean every weapon is perfect. They have their limitations, and in this video we will be looking at the 10 worst weapons in Elden Ring. Now keep in mind this list is purely opinion based, so you might have an entirely different opinion on this one. Anyway, let's jump straight into the video and look at the worst weapons in Elden Ring. Short Spear. The first weapon on the list might not be the worst weapon in the game, and certainly some people are going to disagree with us in the comments. This is because the Short Spear is used by the chumpiest elements in the game. This weapon is one of the many starter weapons that's quickly outclassed by basically everything else. Compared to the standard spear, this weapon just doesn't really measure up in any way. It's shorter, it's weaker, and while the requirements to wield the normal spear are higher than trying to use this thing, it's not going to take you long to hit those requirements. Basically, what makes this weapon so bad is right there in the name. It's a spear that's short. The only reason you'd want a spear is to hit enemies from further away. That's the main function of a spear, right? So having a short spear just kinda totally defeats that purpose. Like the flail, which we will look at next, you can of course put on some better ashes and get this weapon in a slightly more usable state. But there's little reason to do so when there are so many other spears that fill the same role, but are just flat out better than this one. The flail. Alright, the flail is a gimmick weapon which does not offer much. You can get your hands on this weapon early on in the game. You can find the flail in a chariot in the Gatefront ruins. This weapon has pretty weak strength and dexterity scaling, and does pretty low standard damage. It also has a pretty pathetic skill called Spinning Chain. You just spin the flail around in front of you. The range is not good, and it's not that strong, and offers you little protection. We doubt any player finds this weapon useful. Pretty much every other flail in the game fills the same role but better, making the regular old flail kind of a joke. Of course, you can always swap out the ashes for something better and upgrade this thing to improve its scaling, but you know at the end of the day, you've got a pretty slow weapon that just doesn't play to very many build strengths. It's hardly the worst weapon ever, but it just doesn't really serve a function to us. It's a weapon that's just there, and that's it. Serpent Hunter. Up next, we have a weapon that's great for just one boss fights in the game, and after that it has no other purpose. You can't even swap out the ashes for anything else, so there's little reason to ever use it, outside of the boss fight. Like a lot of Souls games, this is a thing. It's just another cool weapon in that one moment, but in every other instance, it's a total piece of junk. BRIAR Greatshield. Now that we've taken a look at the early game weapons, which are obviously not going to be the best weapons in the game, let's take a look at some other bad weapons. We now move on to the Shaded Castle, where we find the BRIAR Greatshield. This weapon is actually dropped by the boss from that area, and has one big glaring flaw to it. It's a great shield that doesn't block all physical damage. Most regular shields manage to block all damage, but this gigantic tower shield that weighs 9.5 and equipment load can only manage 82%. Like, that's really a downside to having this shield. Sure, if you wanted to use it as a weapon, it's got a pretty strong passive bleed effect, but who actually does use a shield as a weapon? Okay, this is Elden Ring in a Souls game. People definitely do out there, but for most people, they're just going to use a sword or something to cause bleed buildup, not their shield. For us and a lot of players out there, a shield with anything less than 100% physical defense might as well not exist because we're not using it here. Especially with this weapon coming so late in the game, well after players have already found tons of shields that give them full protection and more benefits. You know, some people are probably using it, but we know we certainly are not. The Torch. This is yet another item that is or can be used as a weapon, and it's really not worth. Why? The only reason most people will want one of these things is to illuminate dark areas, and it is really good for that at least. As a weapon though, it's pretty subpar. Yeah, it might be useful for doing some fire damage early in the game, but little bit of fire and barely any physical damage isn't going to cut it for long. However, nobody is using this as their primary weapon. The torch can also be later replaced with a lantern in order to illuminate caves. With a proper lantern, you really have no use for the torch anymore, so it's not a great weapon, and at certain points it stops being a useful tool. Now, we're glad the torch is in the game because it is still kind of fun to use in specific use cases and examples, but it really serves not a lot of purpose, and for that we're gonna still count it as one of the worst. The Soldier's Crossbow. Up next, we have the worst crossbow in the game, mainly because it does less damage. While the stat requirements are low, it's only a few points lower than the next best crossbow in the game. On top of that, it's honestly just kinda hard to get. The only way to grab one of these things is to kill the crossbowmen guarding Stormvale Castle, and the chances that they'll actually drop one is really small. There's just much easier to find, and straight up better crossbows you can get, even right from the start of the game, making this weapon pretty useless. Forked Hatchet. This weapon is obtained early on in the game, and is a weird looking little hand axe used by the dungeon imps. It's another weapon that trades power for some kind of blood loss build-up effect, but with so many weapons that cause bleeding, there's really no reason to use this over something else that's more effective. Well, unless you want to run around as an imp maybe? There's not a whole lot to say about this one that we haven't already said about previous weapons. It's just an early game thing that quickly gets outclassed in pretty much every way and doesn't do much to compensate for that. Staff of the Guilty. Imagine you're using a staff in a game like Elden Ring. You most likely are going to gravitate towards something that scales with intelligence because staffs are primarily for casting sorceries. Incantations usually use faith and are cast using seals. Sorceries usually use intelligence and are cast using staffs. That's just how it works in this game. But there's one and only one staff that doesn't scale with intelligence at all, the Staff of the Guilty. This thing doesn't cast incantations. You can still only use it to cast sorceries. So you still need to have the stat requirements to cast those spells, but it won't boost their power at all. Instead, it'll give you a boost to certain thorn sorceries and also causes blood loss buildup, something it seemed like half the weapons in the game do, and better than this one does. It also boosts specific thorn sorceries, one that don't have an intelligence requirement. If you really want to use those very specific spells, it's good for that, but this thing is so niche it's hard to call it a good weapon at all, especially when so many other staffs give you more substantial boosts for your spell casting. Torch Pole. The Torch Pole is basically just a mediocre spear that little fire damage. It does look a little cool, but the pathetic damage output and the fact that it really has no utility as a torch sinks this weapon to be near the very bottom of this list. Rickety Shield. This is not a weapon, it's rather a joke in the game. The description for the weapon in the game says it all. A creaky old wooden shield, circular in shape, roughly reinforced with vines or some such. There are countless other shields available of better make. This piece of scrap isn't worth the effort of equipping. Yeah, the game literally says that this thing isn't worth equipping. In a game where pretty much everything is at least a little viable, this shield stands head and shoulders above everything else as being basically useless. Do you agree with this list? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.